For decades, the Pacific night had belonged to Japan. Its darkness was not feared, but studied measured in silhouettes, moon angles, and the faint glow of phosphorescent wakes. Japanese sailors believed the sea after sunset was not chaos, but a disciplined environment, one that rewarded patience, eyesight, and nerve. In that darkness, they felt at home. The Imperial Japanese Navy built this confidence deliberately. Crews were trained to see what others missed. Optical rangefinders, binoculars, and practiced judgment replaced machines. Star shells and flares were not crude tools, but extensions of human perception. Night fighting was taught as an art one mastered only through repetition and restraint. Victory, they believed, belonged to the man who could see first. That belief had been reinforced in blood. In 1942, Japanese destroyers and cruisers had torn apart Allied formations under cover of darkness. At Savo Island and in the early Solomon battles, American ships were struck before they understood where the enemy was. Those nights became doctrine. Darkness was not merely cover, it was a weapon, sharpened by experience. And for a time, it worked. The Pacific was vast, its nights long and empty. Against opponents reliant on daylight formations and rigid command structures, Japan's night tactics delivered shock and humiliation. Success hardened into certainty. Certainty became tradition. But while Japanese lookouts trained their eyes, something quieter was happening across the ocean. In American shipyards and laboratories, detection was being separated from vision. Distance was no longer guessed, it was measured. Bearings no longer estimated, they were calculated. Radar did not need moonlight. It did not care for clouds, smoke, or human fatigue. This revolution did not announce itself with gunfire. It hummed softly in plotting rooms, glowing faintly on green screens. And when Japan sailed once more into the night, confident in the darkness that had always protected them, they did not realize that the night itself had changed. They entered believing they could see everything. They did not yet know they were already invisible. The divide between the two fleets was not merely technical, it was cultural. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been shaped by an almost feudal ideal of warfare, one that prized mastery, discipline, and the perfection of human skill. Training was exhaustive and selective. Officers and crews drilled endlessly in night maneuvers, torpedo attacks, and visual coordination. The destroyer was not just a ship, it was a dueling blade, wielded by men expected to act with initiative and honor in moments of darkness. Japanese destroyers were conceived as torpedo knights. Long-range oxygen-fueled weapons, fired in silence, were meant to decide battles before gunfire began. Success depended on judgment, on the ability to read shadows, estimate distance, and strike without being seen. This philosophy rewarded intuition and punished hesitation. Machines were tools, but never masters. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy had reached a different conclusion, forged through early failure. The night disasters of 1942 exposed weaknesses not just in tactics, but in thinking. American commanders did not respond by doubling down on tradition. They questioned it. After-action reports were dissected, errors cataloged, and assumptions discarded. Learning became institutional rather than personal. Where Japan trusted the trained eye, the Americans began to trust systems. Radar plots replaced shouted bearings. Fire control solutions emerged from calculations, not guesswork. Young sailors, often barely out of training, sat in darkened rooms interpreting blips that meant life or death for ships miles away. Authority shifted quietly from bridge wings to plotting tables. This was not an abandonment of courage, but a redefinition of it. The American destroyer was no longer a lone duelist in the night. It was a node in a network, guided by information rather than instinct. Two navies still shared the same ocean, but by late 1943, they were no longer fighting the same kind of war, and neither yet understood how wide that gap had become. The advantage the Americans carried into the night was not dramatic, and it was not visible from the deck. It was mathematical. SG radar, operating in the 10-centimeter band, did not search for shapes or silhouettes. It measured time. A pulse left the antenna, struck metal miles away, and returned. From that interval, distance was calculated with certainty not guessed, not inferred. Where the human eye struggled beyond a few thousand yards, radar extended perception outward for miles. Entire formations appeared on screens long before a lookout could sense their presence. Bearings updated continuously. Speed, course, and separation were plotted in quiet compartments below deck. The enemy existed as data before he existed as a sight. This changed the sequence of battle itself. Detection no longer followed, contact it preceded it. American ships could maneuver into firing positions while still unseen, shaping the fight before the first shot. Torpedo solutions were prepared without flares. Guns could be laid using radar ranges, removing the need for illumination that once betrayed position. The Japanese possessed no comparable system at sea. Their destroyers entered the night relying on trained eyesight and disciplined timing, the same methods that had served them in earlier years. But those methods required proximity. They required light, even if only briefly, and they required the enemy to remain blind as well. Radar erased those assumptions. Electronics did not tire. They did not blink. They were not fooled by cloud or spray. A steel hull reflected energy, whether it wished to or not. Against that certainty, courage and experience could not close the gap. By the time Japanese lookouts would have expected first contact, by the time a flare might have risen, the Americans already knew where they were going, and how long it would take to destroy them. The battle that followed would feel sudden, even unfair. But in truth, it had already been decided silently, numerically, and long before the night revealed anything at all. By late 1943, the Solomon Islands had slipped from headlines, but not from strategic relevance. The chain of jungle-covered islands still guarded sea lanes that connected Japan's remaining strongholds in the Central Pacific. Control of these waters determined whether men, fuel, and ammunition could move at all. Even as the front shifted westward, the Solomons remained a narrowing corridor one Japan could not afford to abandon hastily. For the Japanese Navy, the mission had become defensive and desperate. What once had been aggressive reinforcement runs were now evacuations and resupply efforts, conducted under mounting pressure. Destroyers were tasked with shepherding troops and materials away from exposed positions, often at night, when survival still seemed possible. These were not glory operations. They were necessities. The Americans understood this pattern. By 1943, intelligence, reconnaissance, and radar coverage allowed U.S. forces to anticipate movement rather than react to it. Instead of guarding every route, they waited along the most likely ones. Interception replaced pursuit. Small, fast task groups were positioned not to defend territory, but to cut arteries. One such interception would unfold near the northern tip of New Ireland, in waters few outside naval charts could name. It would later be known as the Battle of Cape Street. George, a clash too brief and too one-sided to alter maps, yet profound in what it revealed. On the night of November 24-25, Japanese destroyers slipped into the darkness on what they believed was a routine operation. The sea was calm, the sky unremarkable. There was no sense of impending disaster, only the familiar tension of night sailing in contested waters. Lookouts scanned the horizon. Engines maintained steady revolutions. Unseen, an American force was already maneuvering. Courses were adjusted quietly. Bearings were checked and rechecked. No flares were fired. No guns were trained skyward. The ocean between the two formations steadily collapsed, mile by mile, without either side laying eyes on the other. It was a small engagement by the standards of the war. But as the two forces converged in silence, it carried implications far larger than the ships involved, and neither side yet understood how final the test was about to be. At the center of the American formation was a commander who understood exactly what this night represented. Arleigh Burke was not known for theatrics or grand speeches. His confidence came from preparation and almost clinical faith in information, timing, and restraint. He trusted what his ships could see on screens more than what any man might glimpse over a railing. Burke viewed destroyers not as expendable escorts, but as thinking weapons. Fast, coordinated, and lethal when used correctly. They were platforms for information as much as firepower. In his mind, radar did not merely support the battle, it commanded it. Decisions flowed from data, not instinct. The night was something to be solved, not challenged. Fire discipline was central to his plan. Burke understood that illumination, once essential to night combat, now carried risk. A flare revealed as much as it clarified. He forbade it. Guns would remain silent until the mathematics were certain. Torpedoes would be launched without warning, guided by solutions generated in plotting rooms far below the bridge. Surprise would not come from darkness, but from invisibility. He divided his force deliberately, assigning roles with precision. One group would strike, another would block escape. The geometry of the engagement was drawn long before the enemy was aware of contact. It was not aggression that guided him, but control of distance, timing, and information. There was no bravado in Burke's orders. They were brief, unemotional, transmitted in clipped phrases that assumed understanding rather than demanded obedience. Every ship knew its place. Every crew knew its task. The confidence aboard the American destroyers did not come from underestimating the enemy, but from believing the system would hold. As the range closed, no one strained to see the horizon. No binoculars searched for shadows. Eyes were fixed on glowing screens and penciled plots. The enemy existed there first reduced to numbers, vectors, and time. And somewhere ahead, still trusting the night as they always had, a Japanese column sailed on unaware that the battle had already been arranged, and that the first decision had been made without a single word spoken aloud. The Japanese column moved with quiet purpose. Its mission, on paper, was simple and familiar: escort vulnerable ships through contested waters under cover of darkness. These were not ships built for battle, but for necessity transports carrying men and supplies away from exposed positions. The destroyers around them were shields, trusted to see first and strike first if needed. The assumptions guiding the operation were inherited from years of experience. Night meant concealment. Speed meant safety. Surprise was expected to favor the escort, not the attacker. American forces, it was believed, would hesitate in darkness or betray themselves with illumination. If contact came, it would come visibly with flares, gunfire, and warning. Japanese lookouts performed their duties with practiced focus. Binoculars swept the horizon in slow arcs. The sea appeared empty, its surface broken only by wake and moonlit ripple. No engines were heard beyond their own. No silhouettes crossed the stars. To trained eyes, the night offered reassurance. What they did not have was warning. No radar returns whispered of distant shapes. No electronic pulse announced an approaching threat. The column advanced blind, unaware that detection had already occurred, unaware that their course and speed were being plotted with cold precision. Because there was no sign of danger, there was no reason to maneuver. Formation held. Speed remained constant. Torpedoes stayed unfired. Guns were not brought to readiness. Every decision made aboard those ships was logical based on what could be seen and on what had always been true before. But the absence of information was not neutrality. It was vulnerability. While Japanese commanders waited for evidence of contact, the Americans had already moved into position. Angles were tightening. Distances were shrinking. Escape routes were quietly being denied. The trap did not close with noise or motion. It closed mathematically. Each mile covered by the Japanese column brought them deeper into a geometry they could not perceive. Every minute that passed without incident confirmed their expectations and strengthened the illusion that the night remained on their side. There would be no flare to announce the beginning. No warning shot across the bow, only a sudden violence emerging from darkness that, until that moment, had seemed empty. And as the Japanese ships pressed forward, confident and unalerted, they sailed steadily toward a battle they did not know had already begun. In the American plotting rooms, the enemy did not appear as a silhouette. He appeared as a series of clean, deliberate marks, radar blips that brightened and steadied as range collapsed. The screen showed not mystery, but certainty. Multiple targets in column, consistent speed, steady course. To the men watching, it was as if the darkness itself had been translated into numbers. Ranges were called out in miles. Bearings were refined in degrees. The information flowed upward and outward, turning into decisions before anyone topside could have named what they were hunting. On the bridge, there was no shouting, no sudden panic, only an ordered tightening of focus. The night was calm. The sea was calm. The enemy was already mapped. Target solutions were computed with a precision that would have seemed unnatural only a year earlier. Plotters traced motion, predicted position, and handed torpedo officers the geometry of destruction. This was not the old language of night combat: guess, close, illuminate, fire. This was a new sequence. Detect, calculate, strike. Then, torpedoes were launched invisibly. There were no flares, no tracer fire to announce intent. The weapons left their tubes as quietly as breath. slipping into black water and running on headings set by unseen hands. In that moment, the battle began not with sound, but with decision already executed. American guns remained silent. Burke held them back, refusing to waste the advantage of surprise. Radar could provide range and bearing, but he demanded certainty, confirmation of formation, separation, and timing. A destroyer's gunfire could illuminate more than it destroyed, revealing the attacker's position and dissolving the very invisibility that made the plan possible. Across the water, the Japanese remained unaware. Lookouts scanned empty horizon. Bridges stayed steady. Commands remained routine. No alarm sounded because there was nothing to see. The night, to them, was still the familiar old ally hiding danger until it became visible. But now time had narrowed into seconds. In the American force, each second meant updated range, refined course, improved solution. In the Japanese column, each second meant the opposite: less space, fewer options, and an enemy already in control. The great irony of radar was that it did not merely reveal ships, it revealed inevitability. Once the geometry was set, escape required knowing you were already trapped. And in that November darkness, a Japanese formation sailed forward in perfect discipline, while beneath the waves, the first torpedoes ran toward them with no light, no warning, and no mercy. The first explosions arrived without explanation. Japanese ships were struck not after maneuver, not after exchange, but mid-course torpedoes detonating against hulls that had not yet altered speed or heading. Steel tore open below the waterline. Power failed. Columns shattered. For crews still scanning darkness for enemies they believed must reveal themselves, the shock was paralyzing. What followed was not a single blow, but a sequence. Torpedo strikes came in calculated intervals, each one exploiting the confusion left by the last. Ships were hit before commands could be issued, before formations could break cleanly, before understanding could replace instinct. The discipline that had once defined Japanese night combat now worked against them, keeping vessels on predictable paths inside a geometry already mastered by their attacker. Confusion spread without clarity. Bridges could not determine where the threat lay. There was no muzzle flash to orient toward, no flare to frame a counterattack. Damage reports arrived, fragmented and incomplete. Some ships believed they had struck mines, others suspected submarines. None grasped the full shape of the assault. Attempts to flee followed instinct rather than information. Damaged ships turned blindly, exposing fresh angles. Undamaged vessels accelerated into darkness, hoping distance might restore safety. But escape routes had already been calculated. Radar tracked every maneuver, every change in speed, every widening wake. What felt like chaos to the Japanese appeared as order on American screens. The pursuit was methodical. American destroyers adjusted course with restraint, closing only when advantage was certain. Gunfire was used sparingly, when required, guided by radar rather than sight. There was no rush, no improvisation. The battle unfolded as a controlled process, rather than a contest of wills. Over the course of 2 hours, 6 Japanese vessels were sunk or fatally crippled destroyers, and accompanying ships lost not to overwhelming force, but to sequencing and information. American ships suffered no losses. No hull was breached. No sailor was killed. It was an outcome that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier, not because Japanese crews lacked courage, but because courage had ceased to be decisive. When the firing finally ceased, the sea returned to silence. Burning wreckage drifted unseen beyond the range of vision, marked only by radar echoes fading one by one. The night had not been conquered by bravery or chance. It had been reduced, measured, predicted, and exhausted, leaving behind a result so clean it felt unreal, and a question that would haunt the war to its end. How could a battle end before one side ever knew it had truly begun? The destruction was not the result of surprise alone. It was the consequence of asymmetry. Japanese ships did not lack weapons, nor did their crews lack training. What they lacked was the ability to see the battle as it actually existed. Without radar fire control, detection and engagement remained inseparable. One could not happen without the other. Japanese torpedoes were formidable, long-ranged, fast, and lethal, but they required targets that could be located, tracked, and fixed in space. In this battle, there were none. The Americans did not illuminate. They did not close unnecessarily. They did not announce their presence with gunfire until it no longer mattered. A torpedo, however advanced, is only as effective as the information that guides it. Here, information was absent. Doctrine compounded the problem. Japanese night fighting doctrine assumed a visible enemy. Flares were expected. Searchlights were planned for. The sequence of decision-making, detect, identify, close, strike, depended on moments of visual confirmation. When those moments never arrived, the system stalled. Orders could not be issued because there was nothing to respond to. This produced paralysis at the command level. Bridges received reports of explosions without direction. Damage control teams fought flooding while officers attempted to determine whether to maneuver, counterattack, or withdraw. Each option required knowledge they did not possess. The battle unfolded faster than human senses could reconstruct it. Training, once Japan's greatest advantage, now revealed its limits. Sailors drilled to perfection in visual estimation and coordinated torpedo attack found those skills suddenly unusable. The habits that had been built over years could not be adapted in minutes. Experience did not translate because the environment itself had changed. In this context, courage lost its meaning. Bravery presumes agency, the ability to act in the face of danger. Here, danger arrived without form. Men could not choose to fight or flee because they did not know where the enemy was. Heroism, traditionally measured in decisive action, was rendered irrelevant by invisibility. What defeated the Japanese force was not superior numbers or reckless aggression. It was a system that functioned regardless of human perception. Radar did not hesitate. It did not misjudge. It did not require confirmation from the eye. Once contact was established electronically, the outcome followed with mechanical inevitability. Skill had not vanished. It had been bypassed. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. In modern naval war, mastery of the sea no longer belonged to those who could see best in the dark, but to those who no longer needed to see at all. Within hours, the engagement was being described in unusually restrained language. There was no celebration, no embellishment. In internal assessments, it was treated not as a triumph of aggression, but as a confirmation proof that a new way of fighting had reached maturity. The reports focused on sequence, timing, and control. Emotion was absent. Precision was not. From a tactical standpoint, the action bordered on clinical. Every phase unfolded as designed. Early detection, disciplined withholding of fire, torpedo attack at optimal range, containment of escape routes, and controlled pursuit. There were no improvisations born of desperation, no last-minute corrections forced by error. The plan had not merely survived contact with the enemy, it had erased the need for adjustment. Most striking was what did not occur. No American ship was hit, no hull was pierced, no crewman was wounded. Even superficial damage was absent. In an era when night battles were synonymous with confusion and mutual destruction, this outcome defied precedent. It was not simply a victory. It was asymmetry made visible. The lessons were circulated almost immediately. Action reports were distributed, diagrams reproduced, timelines annotated. This was not filed away as a fortunate encounter. It was treated as doctrine in motion, a template for how destroyers should fight when information dominance was absolute. The emphasis was clear. Radar was not support, it was command. Future engagements would echo these conclusions. Destroyer squadrons trained to fight without illumination. Radar operators were elevated in status, their interpretations carrying weight equal to bridge officers. Fire discipline became a virtue rather than a constraint. The night, once feared for its uncertainty, was reimagined as an environment that could be controlled, provided one accepted the supremacy of systems. In this sense, the battle rewrote the rules of night combat. The old assumptions that darkness favored the bold, that surprise belonged to those willing to risk visibility, were quietly retired. Courage still mattered, but it was now expressed through restraint, patience, and trust in unseen processes. Victory belonged to those who could wait. What made this a turning point was not scale. Larger battles would follow, with greater losses and louder consequences, but few would be as clean or as revealing. This was warfare stripped to essentials: information, timing, execution. It showed what happened when one side arrived fully adapted to the future, and the other arrived carrying the past. Yet the shift did not announce itself. There was no speech, No headline, no sense that history had pivoted. The sea absorbed the wreckage, and the destroyers turned away without ceremony. To most of the world, nothing remarkable had occurred. But in quiet briefing rooms and training commands, something fundamental had changed. Night battles would never again be contests of eyesight and nerve alone. They had become contests of systems, and the outcome, once decided by human judgment in darkness, was now being written silently, miles away, on glowing screens. The turning point passed without witnesses. Only later would its meaning become impossible to ignore. In the aftermath, confusion lingered longer than the smoke. Reports from surviving ships were fragmentary, shaped by shock and incomplete perception. Timelines did not align. Bearings contradicted one another. What had happened seemed disproportionate to what had been seen. For a navy accustomed to reading battles through flashes and silhouettes, this one defied reconstruction. Initial assumptions filled the void. The scale of destruction suggested overwhelming force. Some officers concluded they had blundered into a formation of cruisers, perhaps even battleships. Others suspected multiple task groups converging at once. The idea that a handful of destroyers could inflict such damage so quickly and without suffering any in return felt implausible. Numbers were inflated to make sense of the losses. This misreading delayed understanding. If the enemy had simply been larger, then the failure was situational, not structural. The night, in that interpretation, had not betrayed Japan. It had merely concealed superior force. There was comfort in that explanation. It preserved doctrine. It protected tradition. It allowed the past to remain valid. But evidence accumulated. Intercepts, reconnaissance, and later intelligence pointed toward a more unsettling conclusion. The American force had been small, the engagement brief, the losses decisive. What had changed was not the size of the enemy, but the nature of the encounter. Adjusting doctrine, however, required more than acknowledgement. It required admitting that the foundations of Japanese night fighting, so carefully built, so often validated, were no longer sufficient. That admission came slowly. Training programs emphasized continuity. Tactical manuals evolved cautiously. The belief that skill and courage could compensate for material shortfalls persisted well into the war's final year. Industrial reality compounded the delay. Radar development lagged, constrained by shortages, competing priorities, and limited production capacity. Even when systems became available, integration was uneven. Crews trained late. Doctrine struggled to keep pace. Electronics, when installed, were often inferior in range and reliability to their American counterparts. The gap did not close, it widened. By the time radar began to appear more consistently aboard Japanese ships, the environment had already shifted again. American forces refined their techniques, integrated radar more deeply into command structures, and expanded its use across fleets. What had been an advantage became a baseline. Catching up required not one innovation, but a sequence of them, and time was the one resource Japan no longer possessed. The cost of delay was cumulative. Each engagement fought under outdated assumptions reinforced the imbalance. Losses mounted not because Japanese sailors lacked resolve, but because they were being asked to fight a war that had already moved beyond their preparation. Adaptation arrived incrementally, while defeat arrived all at once. What made this realization particularly bitter was its irony. Japan had once led the world in night naval warfare. It had shaped its identity around mastery of darkness, yet that very success slowed its response to change. Past victories became proof against doubt. Experience became resistance. By the time the lesson was fully understood, it could no longer be acted upon decisively. Radar had not simply altered tactics, it had altered tempo. War now rewarded those who adapted first, not those who adapted best. And so the recognition came late, filtered through loss and disbelief. The night had not betrayed Japan suddenly. It had done so quietly, over time, while certainty delayed adaptation. The tragedy was not that Japan failed to learn. It was that the lesson demanded speed and arrived when speed was no longer possible. What unfolded off Cape St. George was not an anomaly. It was a confirmation. Similar patterns had already appeared across the Pacific, scattered and half understood, waiting to be recognized as part of a larger transformation. Again and again, engagements fought at night ended not in mutual destruction, but in imbalance, one side striking cleanly, the other reacting too late, or not at all. From the waters around Guadalcanal to the long approaches toward the Philippines, Radar began to shape outcomes before commanders fully grasped its implications. Ships that never saw their attackers were damaged or sunk. Fleets maneuvered based on plots rather than sight. The pattern repeated until it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Radar functioned as a force multiplier not because it made weapons more powerful, but because it made decisions faster. It collapsed uncertainty. It removed guesswork. A destroyer guided by radar was no longer limited by the horizon or the endurance of its crew. It could fight at full efficiency regardless of weather, darkness, or fatigue. One well-coordinated task group could neutralize a larger force simply by acting first and knowing it was acting first. This marked the quiet death of heroic naval combat, as it had long been imagined. The image of captains straining through binoculars, of daring charges illuminated by searchlights, of battles decided by nerve and intuition, these did not vanish overnight. But they no longer decided outcomes. Bravery remained present, but it no longer shaped results on its own. Automation began to replace instinct. Calculation supplanted judgment. The human role shifted from direct perception to interpretation of data. Sailors no longer needed to see the enemy to fight him. They needed to trust screens, instruments, and procedures, often relaying information from spaces far removed from the bridge or the gun mount. War itself became less visible. Engagements unfolded beyond the range of the senses, detected only by instruments translating energy into symbols. Decisions were made in darkened rooms by men who never heard the guns they guided. Destruction occurred without spectacle. Ships died quietly, without confrontation, sometimes without understanding why. This invisibility carried moral weight. Distance insulated decision-makers from consequence, even as it increased efficiency. Killing became procedural. Losses were recorded as data points. The emotional immediacy that once restrained action eroded as the process became abstract. Victory arrived without the human cues that had traditionally accompanied it. Yet, humanity lagged behind its machines. Doctrine, culture, and ethics struggled to adapt to a pace set by electronics. Navies trained men to act decisively, but increasingly asked them to defer to systems they could not fully comprehend. Authority migrated toward algorithms and instruments, even as responsibility remained human. This tension between control and detachment, between precision and moral distance, defined the later years of the war at sea. Radar did not merely change tactics. It changed the relationship between human beings and violence. The ocean, once a place of encounter, became a space of calculation. Cape St. George fit neatly into this broader pattern because it revealed the transformation in its purest form. No chaos, no confusion on one side, no heroics required, just information applied faster and more completely than the opponent could respond. The broader lesson was unsettling in its simplicity. Mastery no longer belonged to those who trained hardest to see, but to those who accepted that seeing was no longer necessary. As technology advanced, war did not become cleaner or more humane. It became quieter, more distant, more efficient. And with each step forward, the gap between human instinct and machine capability widened, leaving sailors, commanders, and nations struggling to keep pace with the tools they had unleashed. The night was no longer an environment to be mastered. It had become a medium one in which machines spoke fluently, and humans struggled to understand what they were saying. For the Japanese sailors aboard those ships, death arrived without warning or context. There was no sight of the enemy, no moment of recognition, no chance to understand what was happening before the ship itself began to fail. One instant, the night was routine engine steady, watches calm. The next, steel ruptured below the waterline, lights went out, and the sea rushed in with unstoppable force. Many never reached the deck. Compartments flooded faster than damage control could respond. Orders were shouted into darkness, cut short by smoke, water, and confusion. Men trained for combat found themselves fighting something more elemental than an enemy: gravity, pressure, and time. Some escaped into the water, clinging to wreckage under a sky that gave no explanation for what had occurred. Across the distance, American crews fought a different kind of battle. They fired weapons at targets they never saw, guided by symbols rather than silhouettes. Torpedoes were launched at coordinates, not ships. Gunfire followed instructions relayed from plotting rooms, not commands shaped by visual confirmation. The enemy existed as motion and probability, not as human presence. This separation created a psychological distance unprecedented in naval warfare. Sailors carried out lethal actions without witnessing their effects. There was no immediate feedback, no visible strike, no cries carried across the water, no shared moment of danger. Destruction was inferred later, through fading radar returns and delayed reports. The mind filled in what the senses never encountered. Death without confrontation altered the meaning of combat. Traditional notions of courage, sacrifice, and endurance relied on proximity, on facing danger and being seen by it. Radar war dissolved that encounter. Men could perform their duties flawlessly and never feel the enemy's presence at all. The risk was asymmetrical. Fear existed, but it was abstract, detached from the moment of killing. For some, this efficiency brought discomfort rather than satisfaction. Victory achieved without struggle felt incomplete, even unsettling. The absence of loss on one side did not erase awareness of loss on the other. Sailors understood that ships had gone down, that men had died unseen, unheard. The quiet success carried a moral weight no medal could resolve. There was no spectacle to mark the end of the fight, no cheering on deck, no dramatic silhouettes burning against the horizon. The American destroyers turned away under radio silence, their work complete. Radar screens went blank as targets disappeared, not into surrender, but into the sea. The night reclaimed its surface calm. For survivors in the water, silence followed terror. Wreckage drifted, oil spread. The machinery of war moved on, leaving human lives suspended between survival and abandonment. Rescue was uncertain. The sea offered no distinction between victor and defeated. This was the human cost of invisibility. Men became casualties, not of visible enemy action, but of systems operating beyond perception. The killing was precise, controlled, and distant, and therefore harder to reconcile. War had always demanded death, but it had once demanded witnesses as well. Radar stripped that away. It removed the shared danger that once linked opposing crews in mutual recognition. What remained was outcome without encounter, destruction without dialogue. In the days that followed, reports would be written, numbers tallied, lessons extracted. But for the men inside the steel, the experience resisted summary. Some would remember the sudden violence without understanding its source. Others would remember a calm night, a command given, a screen watched followed by silence. Victory, achieved without spectacle, left no image to hold on to, only absence. And when the sea finally settled, it carried no memory of what had passed. No markers remained to show where men had fought or died or never even known they were under attack. The night ended as it began, quiet, indifferent, and empty, while beneath its surface, the cost of precision lay scattered in darkness, unseen by those who had learned how to fight without ever looking back. The lesson revealed by that night was neither subtle nor new. War had always rewarded those who adapted first. What changed was the speed at which adaptation became mandatory. Innovation no longer complemented tradition, it replaced it. Systems did not merely assist valor. They determined whether valor could be expressed at all. For Japan, this realization struck at the heart of its naval identity. The Imperial Navy had been built on mastery of technique, discipline, and human judgment refined through repetition. These qualities had once delivered decisive victories. But success, when prolonged, carries its own danger. What works becomes sacred. What is sacred resists change. Radar exposed that rigidity mercilessly. It demonstrated that courage without information was not bravery, but vulnerability. That skill without systems was no longer mastery, but nostalgia. The sea had not grown unfair. It had simply begun to reward different virtues. Adaptation, in this new environment, became a form of survival rather than improvement. Those who integrated technology early gained compounding advantages. Those who hesitated fell further behind with each engagement. It was not enough to recognize change. One had to act before change became visible in defeat. Institutional structures struggled to respond. Doctrine evolved slowly, constrained by hierarchy, scarcity, and belief. Even as evidence mounted, the temptation to explain losses through circumstance rather than transformation remained strong. It was easier to assume misfortune than obsolescence, easier to blame darkness than accept that darkness no longer belonged to anyone. Past success weighed heavily. Victories from 1942 lingered as proof that the old methods still held value. But war does not honor precedent. It does not pause for reflection. Each battle is a test administered only once. and failure carries permanent consequences. The Americans did not win because they were braver, nor because they were more willing to risk. They won because they accepted that war had become an engineering problem as much as a human one. They trusted instruments where others trusted memory. They allowed machines to see first, decide faster, and strike without ceremony. Japan did learn this lesson eventually, but learning without time is knowledge without power. By the moment adaptation was fully understood, the industrial and strategic conditions required to implement it no longer existed. The gap was not technological alone, it was temporal. War's cruelty lies not only in death, but in its refusal to wait. It offers no grace period for adjustment. Those who hesitate are not corrected, they are removed. The wreckage left behind becomes the syllabus for others. In the aftermath, the meaning of Cape Street George did not lie in the ships lost, but in what those losses revealed. They showed that honor, courage, and discipline remain essential but insufficient on their own. They must be paired with flexibility, skepticism, and willingness to abandon what once worked. The lesson was written not in theory, but in steel resting on the ocean floor. Each wreck marked a moment when certainty outpaced reality, when confidence replaced curiosity, when tradition delayed adaptation just long enough to make it fatal. Japan trusted the night because it always had. But the night had changed without asking permission. And when war finally made that clear, it did so without negotiation, leaving behind only silence, debris, and a truth as unforgiving as the sea itself. When the engagement ended, the sea did what it always had. It returned to darkness. Waves closed over torn steel. Oil spread, thinned, and disappeared into the black surface. The Pacific gave no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred. To an observer arriving hours later, the water would have appeared calm, indifferent, unchanged. Beneath that surface lay wreckage no one could see. Hulls rested at angles determined by the final seconds of explosions. Compartments flooded and equalized. The remains of ships that had once carried crews, orders, and certainty settled into silence. There were no markers, no monuments, only depth and pressure, erasing detail with time. On American destroyers, radar screens gradually emptied. Blips faded as targets stopped moving, then vanished altogether. Operators adjusted settings, scanned wider arcs, confirmed what the absence already meant. The battle had ended not with surrender or retreat, but with disappearance. When the screens finally went quiet, there was nothing left to pursue. It was a victory without witnesses. No exchange of gunfire observed from opposing decks. No mutual recognition between adversaries. The men who executed the battle never saw those they defeated. The men who were defeated never saw those who destroyed them. War, in this moment, had become entirely asymmetrical, experienced differently on each side, connected only by consequence. In that absence of spectacle lay the true significance of the night. Something old had ended without announcement. For centuries, naval combat after dark had been shaped by human limits, eyes straining against shadow, commanders gambling on distance and timing, courage measured by willingness to close into danger. That night, those measures ceased to matter. The old night where darkness belonged to those who mastered it was gone. In its place emerged a new domain, governed by signals rather than sight. Electronic pulses replaced flares. Screens replaced horizons. The sea became a field of data, where advantage belonged to those who could detect first, decide fastest, and strike without revealing themselves. War no longer waited to be seen. This shift did not feel dramatic at the time. There were no declarations, no recognition that a threshold had been crossed. It unfolded quietly, the way technological revolutions often do through routine success rather than sudden catastrophe. Yet its implications were profound and irreversible. From that point forward, naval warfare would increasingly be fought beyond human senses. Distance would grow. Reaction times would shrink. Decisions would be shaped by machines interpreting environments too complex and too fast for instinct alone. The human role would not vanish, but it would change, becoming supervisory rather than perceptual. Cape Street George mattered not because of its scale, but because of its clarity. It revealed a future in which mastery depended less on tradition than on adaptation, less on bravery than on integration, less on seeing than on knowing. The sea that night offered no resistance to this change. It absorbed the wreckage and moved on. But for those who studied what happened, and for those who fought afterward, the meaning could not be ignored. War had entered a new phase, one that rewarded foresight over experience and flexibility over confidence. The irony was stark. Japan had once ruled the night through discipline and daring. It had trusted darkness as an ally, believing it immutable. But darkness, like war itself, does not remain loyal to those who rely on it. It evolves alongside the tools used to penetrate it. By the time the lesson became undeniable, it had already been written into the seabed, each wreck a sentence, each loss a warning. The night had not betrayed anyone. It had simply changed faster than belief could follow. And so, as the Pacific returned to silence and the ships sailed on, history marked the moment quietly, without ceremony. A battle ended. An era closed. Another began, one defined not by shadow, but by signal. Japan trusted the darkness. The darkness had already learned to see.